I'm Charles Buki. This is my colleague, Pete Lombardi. We've been in and out of Erie, as you may know, for on and off for the better almost 2 years. It's culminated, at least this stage of the effort, in a document. It's a comprehensive plan. We like to think of it as a decision-making guide, and we would encourage you to think of it that way. I'll set up some introductory comments, walk us through the first session, hand it off to Pete, and then we'll repeat that several occasions. If that's all right with everybody. How's the mic? It works fine? A couple of acknowledgements. I think it's always important to do that. I do definitely want to call out the Jefferson Society. The leading edge work to bring a group like this can't be overstated. It's not singularly, but it's darn near singularly uncommon. We've had special support recently from Ben, from Verke, from Perry. We do want to acknowledge that. And then during the process, I want to call out a few folks who helped us especially. The late Melanie Johnson was instrumental in pulling us into the city and in instituting in us a commitment to the city that went well beyond the narrow scope of the contract. I just want to take a second and thank her for that. Kim Green, who's no longer with the city, was instrumental in being a very good working partner to both Pete and me and our staff and our team in the course of a long project. Barbara Chafee at the partnership, Michelle Griffin, Anna Franz from 2040 Emerge, Kathy Wyrosdick at the county, the Erie Community Foundation, and the Erie Downtown Partnership. Without the data, the support, the guidance, the expertise, we wouldn't have been able to get our sea legs and wrap our head around some of the issues. We're going to work in 3 chunks: principles, projects, and implied partnerships. And before I lead off on the principles part, a couple of quick observations. After some 25 years in this field, I'm absolutely convinced that cities are very much like individuals when they're in trouble, which is to say that they have to hit bottom. And another way to describe that is they have to get sick and tired of being sick and tired. I think in this collection of folks, in the work that we've seen occur, and the early stages of response to the plan, a room like this convinces us that we are now pointed in the right direction. 2 acknowledgements they put some wind at our backs, at least in terms of our learnings. My colleague Joanna Scholl, who's based in San Francisco, she used to say, both to us internally and to our clients, you have to want it bad. You really have to want it bad. And from my mentor, Ron Heifetz, what he taught, and we think we've incorporated into our work and in this plan, is that you have to be willing to let go of old ideas. And so what this plan is, at the end of the day, it is a manifestation, it's an argument to let go of old ideas. And when you do that, you create a vacuum. Today's really an opportunity to step into that space, having let go of old ideas, and we'll try to identify some of them and carve out some room for that. But having let go of old ideas, what goes into that space? 3 quick points as we go to principles. Business as usual here in Erie is no longer working. I don't think that we can see any way around dancing around that. So what kind of does that mean? And at the risk of being a little crude, I'm not known for having good filters, right? You have to stop doing stupid shit. You really, if you're in a hole, the first thing you have to do is to stop digging if you want your way out. I'm always frustrated with national polls that repeat. Every morning I wake up, the Washington Post tells me that, their latest ABC Washington Post poll says 80% of America thinks the country's on the wrong track. Right? Except that nobody can agree, what's the track to take. Before we get to there, we have to stop doing what we're doing. Right? So this plan, in many respects, is a stake in the ground. Right? Business as usual is not working. The second piece of this business as usual, is stop complaining, right? And stop pointing fingers. Right? Our Atlantic Monthly moderator would remember that from the Carter days. A very, very important admonition, right? Otherwise known as stop crying, right? Start sweating. Right? So there's a big bit of work here in turning the Queen Mary. The third is stop waiting for somebody else to exercise leadership. You won't hear Pete and I ever use the word leader. We'll always refer to the work of exercising leadership. Right? So it's important to stop waiting for somebody else to step into that vacuum. So what we've done in this plan is we've oriented the argument so that it's start building on strengths. Right? We concede there will be different viewpoints on what defines a strength. Right? That's a conversation you have to have. We can't do that for you. We've done our best to identify it, but start building on strengths. Right? Start without the albatross of having to function perfectly. Just start. Right? Old planning presumed growth. What differentiates this decision-making guide is that it presumes the need to adapt. Those are not synonymous. A presumption of growth and a presumption of a need to adapt drive different strategies. And so the plan we crafted is not organized around housing. It's not organized around economic development. It's not organized in a manner which leads to a lack of partnership or in silos. It's organized around principles, priorities, projects, and the partnerships therein. Okay. So with that, we flip the slides and hit the principles. So I'll make a few quick comments here. Take a good look at Camden and Flint. Not a passing glance. Take a good look at it. Okay? They were where you are, and they didn't get it right. Okay? You have an opportunity to get it right. All of the tools in this community, the physical assets, the civic infrastructure, it's here. It was there. Okay? So I wanted to start with this slide to let there be no misunderstanding that you are facing an existential crisis. Okay? Others did not do well at this juncture. Next slide. Work is involved. Right? Absolutely, work is involved. The notion of letting go of old ideas is work. So the question is, are you a learning community? And next slide. Your checkbook is a fraction of the size it needs to be relative to the challenges that require resources. By our math, there's about 125 cities in the United States, and Mr. Fallows pointed out Fresno as a good analog, and I would agree. There's, take the Central Valley, right, from Fresno all the way through Madera and work your way south to Edwards Air Force Base. All along 99, I can't remember. All along, is it 99? All along 99, right? It's resources are outstripped by the challenges, right? We think here roughly on a scale of 25 to 1, right? Which means you have to use your public resources incredibly wisely, which means asking what's the optimal use of scarce resources to trigger resources from other sectors to close the gap. Right? Next slide. So Pete will walk you through principles, and then this will embody the first third of this piece on the plan. Is that fair? Good? Okay. Pete?
All right, thanks, Charles. Yeah, so we want to start by going over these 4 principles that are at the heart of the plan. These are principles that reflect the threats and challenges, the existential threats and challenges that Charles just mentioned. And I think the best way to describe them is they're the DNA of the plan. They're expressed in the strategies and recommendations that you find throughout the plan. But as Charles also mentioned, they are critical decision-making filters to utilize outside of the plan. As Erie faces choices over the next 5 to 10 years choices that you can anticipate coming or that you might not be able to anticipate at this point. These are principles that you can latch yourself to, think through them as they apply to a particular set of choices you're making, and make your best judgment about how what you're doing applies, aligns, or doesn't align with these 4 principles. So we'll go through these one by one. The first one is concentrate investments in targeted areas. The second one, protecting and leveraging Erie's assets. Then supporting and building Erie's middle class, strong households that have been choosing for decades now the suburbs over the city. And the last one is reasserting Erie's pedestrian scale. An important point about these principles early on is that these are very integrated. They're highly interlinked. Each one references the others in some ways. So the first principle, concentrating investments in targeted areas. Why is this one of the 4 principles? And there are a few simple answers to this why question. One is that returns are faster and success is more probable when you focus your resources. As Charles showed in one of those early slides, where you have far fewer resources than the magnitude of your problems might be, focusing your resources gives you a better sense or a better chance of achieving transformative change over the course of 5 or 10 years. And an important part of that is the confidence building component of targeting your resources. Progress is more visible when you target and focus your resources, and that stimulates confidence, and that helps pull in sideline investors who might otherwise hesitate, who might otherwise not be certain about taking out their checkbook and placing a bet on Erie. And a good way of thinking about the need to target resources today is by thinking about downtown Erie. I think everyone in this room recognizes that downtown Erie, broadly speaking, has been a focus of investment for the past 3 or 4 or 5 decades. And you have a lot of assets that reflect that level of investment, whether it's the hospital, Gannon University, the public infrastructure like Perry Square, which was recently renovated, obviously what Erie Insurance has been doing, the Warner Theater that Perry noted, the investment at Erie Arena recently. This represents hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in the downtown Erie area over the past several decades. But I think we can also say that those investments haven't been targeted enough, that they haven't been linked carefully enough. So that what you also have on the right side of this slide here is a lot of underutilized, dilapidated looking buildings in downtown Erie. You have a lot of overly wide and unattractive streets that were designed for traffic volumes that were realized back in the 60s and 70s but aren't quite there today, and a lot of empty and underutilized storefronts. So you have all of these tremendous assets downtown, but I think, as someone who really got to know Erie over the past year and a half as part of this project, I can say that I'm not overwhelmed by downtown Erie. And I think a lot of your visitors aren't overwhelmed by downtown Erie, not because you don't have some stellar assets, but because the connective tissue between those assets doesn't give a visitor a lot of confidence that this is a community on the move, that the market is actually working in downtown Erie. So a lot of effort has been focused downtown, but it probably hasn't been focused enough. There's too much tattered space in between downtown's key assets. And on this matter of concentrating your investment, one point that we made throughout the planning process was the importance of local money, of finding local resources, public and private, and targeting those resources, because too often in a city, in a circumstance like Erie, there tends to be an over-reliance on getting state capital or Washington to pay for improvements. And often what you surrender when you ask for Harrisburg or Washington to pay for what you want, you surrender some of the determination over exactly how a project is done, where those resources go. And one example of that lack of determination and a misapplication of resources really can be seen in the housing revitalization, neighborhood revitalization funding that Erie has spent for the last 3 or 4 decades from Washington. That's tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars that have been put into housing rehab and neighborhood revitalization, and the federal guidelines basically channel those dollars into a city's weakest neighborhoods. Every city in Erie's shape has sort of fallen for this, basically taking the federal money, channeling it into the weakest neighborhoods, and in so doing, reinforcing concentrations of poverty and not actually changing the underlying dynamics of that neighborhood, so that after a decade or two of sometimes concerted investment of federal resources, you go back to those neighborhoods and you don't really see that much has changed. It's not apparent that tens of millions of dollars, probably over $100 million have been spent in Erie's weakest neighborhoods over the past few decades. So local money matters, identifying those resources, pooling them together, public and private, and then having the ability to really focus where they go. The second principle, tied to that first one, protecting and leveraging Erie's assets. So why is this important? This might not make sense on sort of first blush here, but one of the reasons why it's important to focus on assets rather than focusing on your weaknesses and liabilities is that building upon assets costs less than fixing problems, and it builds fiscal capacity to expand your work. One way of thinking about this, because it's a psychological trick, is that if you think about Erie's housing challenge right now, almost 5,000 vacant housing units, almost 2,000 of them are abandoned. Almost 40% of the city's residential building stock is moderately or severely distressed, shows overwhelming signals of disinvestment. If you think about that problem, it's overwhelming, and it's hard to know exactly where to start if you focus on that broad weakness in the city's residential market. But if you sort of pivot and think about assets and think about downtown as being one of the clear, potentially world-class assets of the city, and think about how blighted and dilapidated housing is compromising that asset and has been scaring away investors from certain areas of downtown for a long time now, that concentrates the mind. Then you think about maybe 1 or 2 blocks on either side of the east and west boundaries of downtown, and think about how many blighted homes are in those blocks, what would it cost to acquire, demolish, or rehab some of those blighted properties, and how can we begin that work to protect and strengthen that particular precious asset. That's a way of thinking about a weakness in reference to an asset that makes the work much more focused and doesn't overwhelm you with this big problem, this big citywide problem where you just don't know where to start. And so it's important on almost every project that this community undertakes over the next few years that references the comprehensive plan to always tie a project or program to an asset or to an asset that is being strengthened by that program. It has to be crystal clear. What is that asset? It could, there could be a conversation about what constitutes an A-level asset like a downtown or the Bayfront. What's a B-level asset like an institution or a landmark? What's a C-level asset? There are lots of conversations that can be had about what constitutes an asset. But getting in the habit of thinking in terms of assets and really using that to focus the work around otherwise daunting issues. The third principle, supporting and building Erie's middle. This was a particular focus of the analytic work behind the plan, and we think it was really crucial to embed in the principles. Why is it important to support and build Erie's middle? Because that is critical civic infrastructure. That is, people who serve on commissions and boards, people who serve as neighborhood leaders, the middle class households that have been the bedrock of a lot of industrial communities in the United States, are really are critical infrastructure for a strong and healthy community. So that's one reason why you want to build that middle as much as you can. And connected to that, these are households that pay more into the city's coffers than they typically need in services. And what's really interesting, what was really striking about the analysis side of this project was something we did looking at the distribution of households in Erie County in 1969 versus 2013. And just how much changed between those two dates. So this chart from 1969 shows how many households were making these income ranges in 1969. The blue bar shows how many households were in the city of Erie. The orange bar shows how many households were outside of the city but still within Erie County. And what is striking about this is just how even all of this was. That middle bar there, and this was adjusted for inflation, that middle bar, households making $50,000 to $75,000, you almost had as many in the city as you had outside of the city. Just a striking level of evenness between the city and its suburbs. And then you go to 2013, you actually had 20% more households making over $50,000 in 2013 compared to 1969. You had more total households making more than $50,000 recently compared to the end of the 1960s. But there was a complete shift in where those households were going and where those households were choosing to live within Erie County. So that middle bar, the $50,000 to $75,000 range, you now have twice as many households living outside of the city as you have in the city. And critically, you now have this very large bars at the bottom here, very large blue bars at the bottom, so that the city has this overwhelming concentration of the poorest households in the Erie region, and this tremendous under-concentration of households in the middle. And again, when you compare that to 1969, even at that lower, at the under $20,000 households, you had almost an even concentration between the city and county. So that's striking.
So two points, go back one slide, please. So what's really important here, in addition to the evenness and the spread, is think of that as a family's prospectus, or 100,000 people's, 30,000 families' prospectus 45 years ago. That's the purchasing power for public finance. It's also the basis upon which you project demand for roads, for water treatment, for housing, for schools, for infrastructure, for police cars, for everything that you would purchase with tax dollars, right? That bond doesn't get paid off that year. That bond is a 40 or 50 year life, and the bricks and mortar that the bond purchases have hundreds of years of life and decades of maintenance and other costs that you amortize over a long period of time. Next slide. Now you're asking a much smaller blue, go back to the previous slide, to pay off what that buyer thought was affordable 40 years prior. And therein is the great dilemma, right? That's why we've calculated a $600 million effort to get to par. Okay, I'm sorry, keep going, Peter.
No problem. And this is how it's expressed in a bar chart. And when you express it physically across the city by looking at this map that many of you have probably already seen, it's in the plan. This is the map that is based on the field scoring that we did for the plan, rating every single residential property in the city on a 1 to 5 scale. The red on the map are properties that show many signals of distress and disinvestment. Green are very healthy properties, very well maintained, very marketable. And what you see with this big red oval here are sort of these critical areas between 26th Street and 38th Street where you have middle neighborhoods where you have households that have some discretionary income, where you have a lot of folks who are sort of making decisions right now. Do I fix that roof that I should have fixed a few years ago, but I'm just not feeling the right vibe for this neighborhood? Should I go ahead and repaint my house right now, or should I put vinyl on it? Should I do the extra mile on my landscaping when it's clear that no one else on this block cares about landscaping? What's happening in that middle band of neighborhoods there really speaks to the choices that have been made over the past 30 or 40 years, and over the next 5 or 10 years, what happens to all of these yellow properties, all of these properties in the middle that could go either way, will really determine how healthy Erie is in 2025 and 2030. And the last principle, reasserting Erie's pedestrian scale. So really this is about embracing the traditional urbanism of Erie as a city that grew tremendously during the 19th century and before the age of the automobile, and has a great urban DNA that is now increasingly being embraced by the market. That's why this is a principle of the plan, because this is what the market wants today. A lot of other places that have emerged since World War II are trying to manufacture today what Erie has in terms of this pedestrian scale environment. Erie already has it. It's a very durable competitive advantage that Erie needs to embrace and protect and strengthen. And importantly, as you invest in the pedestrian scale infrastructure in Erie and make it more desirable, increase demand for space within that infrastructure footprint, it decreases the overall cost of that infrastructure. You have greater densities and utilization. It brings down the overall cost on a per capita basis over time. And really, it all comes down to embracing Andrew Ellicott's original vision for Erie back in 1795 when Pennsylvania sent him to the shores of Lake Erie to survey and lay out this area that they had recently acquired. That I think is very much draws from William Penn's plan for Philadelphia. And Center City today in Philadelphia, very much this footprint here is an important part of that city beginning to become more stable. Philadelphia still has lots of problems to grapple with, but the strength of what's happening in the Center City footprint and the desirability that represents for households today and businesses today is something that Erie really needs to embrace in all of its decisions. So those four principles, again, are sort of the DNA of the plan, and they're reflected in prioritization and strategies that you see in the plan. One way of looking at prioritization of the plan is looking at the pages that describe these three areas of work. Where this first area, the core strengthening area, is recognition that the downtown and the Bayfront are these two tandem extraordinary assets, that the Bayfront has the potential to be a world-class asset just by the nature of the landscape there in Presque Isle Bay, and that downtown really does have the bones to be one of America's best downtowns in a mid-sized city. So during the planning process, it was identified fairly early on that making downtown exceptional, making the Bayfront exceptional, had to be priorities. And part of making downtown and the Bayfront exceptional includes making the neighborhoods on either side of downtown better neighborhoods, making them stronger, and reducing the extent to which today they are compromising the health and vitality of downtown because of the blight that you find in those neighborhoods. So that area, that core of Erie, that historic core from the 1795 Andrew Ellicott plan really is singled out in the plan as a priority for making that core as strong as possible, and there are a number of recommendations and strategies that describe that. Then you have what's called a neighborhood strengthening area of work within the plan, that U-shape around the perimeter of Erie, where you have many of those remaining middle neighborhoods in the city, neighborhoods that still have a great deal of stability, a great deal of latent capacity to reinvest in themselves, but they need some intervention today to keep them stable and make them stronger, to keep them from falling too far down to reaching the state that you might find in Little Italy today, or the Pulaski Lighthouse area. Those orange areas on the map we single out in the plan as areas for stabilization. You cannot revitalize downtown, you cannot make downtown in the Bayfront exceptional today while simultaneously revitalizing Little Italy or the Trinity Park planning area or the Pulaski Lighthouse planning area. There simply aren't enough resources to tackle all of that revitalization work simultaneously. So the orange areas on this map are not on the map to completely ignore, but to recognize that different types of work need to happen in those areas at this time. And a lot of that work is stabilizing and reducing the blight, but not investing in those neighborhoods in the same way that downtown and the Bayfront need to be invested in. So putting together this area of work strategy here was a matter of prioritization, recognizing that in order to accomplish something over the next 5 or 10 years, we need to make some hard choices, and we can't guarantee every corner of the city that they will get the same amount of attention. And then in each of these, for each of the planning areas that are on this map, 17 planning areas, each one has then a map in the plan that is designed to express how those 4 principles can be carried out in each of the planning areas. So in the case of West Bayfront, focusing in a particular part of West Bayfront, recognizing that it's the size of a small city, where do you get started? Where can you start in a way that leverages the latent capacity within relatively strong blocks to revitalize fast and really move that neighborhood. So that is a broad overview of those 4 principles, and now we will turn it back over to Mr. Fowles.
Just a minute.